should start now. Okay. طيب بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum and good morning everyone. Thank you for joining us today in this workshop titled Ensuring Assessment Leads to Learning. We are honored to have Professor David Boud, our guest speaker for this workshop. Professor Boud is a professor and foundation director of the Center for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning at Deakin University. He is also an emeritus professor at the University of Technology, Sydney. He has held different positions, including head of school, associate dean, and dean. He has published extensively on teaching and learning and assessment in both higher education and professional education. His current work focuses on the areas of assessment for learning in higher education, academic formation, and workplace learning. He is one of the most highly cited scholars internationally in the field of higher education. He has been a pioneer in developing learning-centered approach to assessment across the disciplines, particularly in building assessment skills for long-term learning, designing new approaches to feedback, and the implications of the digital for assessment. So without further ado, I will just leave the floor for Professor Boud. So Professor Boud, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mojib, for that very good introduction. I'm very pleased to be with you here today. It's late afternoon in Sydney, Australia, where I am, and it's the morning for you. So greetings from where I am. Well, my aim today is to look at assessment and hopefully to look at assessment in some new ways. And what I mean by new ways is we're all very familiar with assessment that we've done for years and years and years. You know, we assess students, we grade them, we give them marks, and that's some record of their performance. But assessment is taking on a much more interesting and powerful influence on learning in recent years. I think it will be fair to say that in the last 10 years at least, there's been a transformation in the way we think about assessment in higher education. So one of the things I want to do today is to introduce you to some of those ideas and to introduce you to ideas about both assessment and about feedback, and to see how we can think about applying those ideas to our courses. So this isn't going to be just tips for how to do things. I want to produce a framework that will show you how things fit together and how the various elements of assessment and different purposes of assessment work together in order to foster high-level student learning. So that's my intention. So what I aim to do is to just say something briefly about my own context so that you know where I'm coming from. Then introduce the problem with assessment. Assessment has created problems for many, many years. And one of the things we have to do is to address what these very difficult problems are with assessment before we can move on. I then want to pose the question, what does assessment need to do? And I'm going to suggest that it needs to do many different things. And our biggest challenge as educators is to ensure that we do all of the things well, not just one of them. We've been used to doing one of them well, and the other one's not very well at all. So what I want to do is to right that balance. And the three things that I want to focus on in terms of what assessment needs to do are the ones on the screen here. First of all, it needs to assure outcomes. That is, assessment needs to assure that the students graduate from our courses at the standard with the level of expertise that we claim they need. That's one thing. And within that, we need to do it in ways in which students are able to do things, not just know things. We don't want our employers to say, well, this student knows an awful lot of information, but I can't use them in my organization. So we need to think about some aspects of assuring outcomes. The second one, that's number 5 here, is that we need assessment to enable learning. As a part of the learning process, we need to assess students so they can improve their learning whilst they're in the course. Not at the end, not later, but whilst they're still learning. And within that, we need to be looking at the notions of feedback. Where does feedback fit in? And how does feedback sit? How does it align with the idea of feedback? How the two go together. And finally, I want to introduce you to a slightly newer idea about assessment, and that is assessment in order to develop students' evaluative judgments. If our graduates graduate, they pass all their examinations, but they don't know what they can do and what they can't do, then they are useless in the world of work. So we need to not just check that our students have met some level of performance we need. We also need them to be able to make judgments about what is it that they can appropriately and not appropriately do. And I'll be talking a bit more about all of these as we go through. So let's start. So the process I want to adopt is I'm going to make a presentation which is going to be stretched out over the whole of our session. But within that, there will be 4 separate breaks for discussion. And I will signal these when we get there. And then I want to have some open discussion at the end. What I would like you to do as I'm speaking is to put your questions in the chat. So click on chat and add your questions to chat. Now, Mojib will be monitoring that. And as soon as we break, he will pose some of those questions to me. After a few of those questions, I will then open it up. And if you put your hand up in Zoom, then I will take your questions in turn. And those breaks will be 5 to 10 minutes, about that length of time. So that's the process I want to proceed with. So where do we start? My context. Well, I mainly work at Deakin University, and Deakin University is a relatively new university. It's about 50 years old, and it's unusual in one respect. It is both a fully face-to-face and a fully distance learning university. And what that means is our students can study on campus or in the cloud at their own discretion. So they can take some subjects face-to-face, some subjects in the cloud. They could take all subjects face-to-face, or they could take all their subjects in the cloud. And that means that there's a seamless interchange between the different modes at Deakin, and that's one of its characteristics. We're also very highly regarded for the quality of our teaching and learning at Deakin, and in the state of Victoria, we have been #1 in terms of the quality of student experience for 12 years in a row. As part of Deakin being a very high quality teaching and learning university, I mean, we do have very strong research as well, but our reputation is on the teaching and learning side. Deakin has also set up My Centre, which is a world-leading research centre to look at assessment and feedback in higher education. So it's not good enough just to be good at teaching. We must be at the very highest standards in research on the quality of teaching and learning as well. So that's where I sit. So let's start on this problem. What is the problem with assessment? Well, you can have all sorts of thoughts yourself about what the problems are, and there might be lots of them. But first of all, assessment needs to satisfy many purposes. And the problem is it doesn't satisfy any one of them very well. And when we try to put all the different purposes together, they're not necessarily compatible with each other. So, for example, assessment typically reflects poorly the kinds of tasks that students will do when they're engaged in the world of practice. the kind of assessment questions we have are the questions you get in educational institutions. They're not often the kind of questions you get or the tasks you get in the real world. So that's one issue. Another issue is that we have a whole range of different learning outcomes, and we're much, much better at achieving some of those than we are at others. So in general, universities are much better at achieving learning outcomes which are to do with subject matter knowledge and technical expertise. We're very good at doing that. What we're not so very good at doing is a whole range of other learning outcomes which are to do with communicating knowledge, of working with other people, of forms of critical thinking with others. And in particular, we're often not very good at helping students judge their own performance, because for somebody to be competent in the world, they need not only to have knowledge and have expertise, but they must know that they have it. They must know what they know and know what they don't know, and know what they can do and know what they can't do. And that is a very challenging prospect. And it's part of our responsibility as university educators to help them develop those skills. So, what is the impact of assessment on students? Well, first of all, it gives students a message about what we value. The students say, it doesn't matter what you say is important in your subject. What counts is what you assess me on. What's in the tests, what's in the examinations. This is the best reflection that I have as a student of what you value. And of course, if your examinations, if your tests, if your assessments do not represent what you value, you need to change them. It's as simple as that. So let's think about that. Are they an accurate reflection of what is most important that students should be learning? Another impact of assessment is that commonly it encourages students to rote learn. And what I mean by that is they memorize information for tests. They reproduce that information in those tests. And they spend too much time on memory work and not enough time on the use of that information to solve real and meaningful problems. And we know an awful lot about that over time. Another thing that assessment does is it distributes students' study time across the year and across the semester. So when there's a test, students' study time goes up. After the test, it drops down. Towards the end of the semester, when there's an examination, student study time goes up. Afterwards, it drops down. So we need to think about assessment as influencing students' study behavior. And perhaps it will be more effective in terms of student learning for them to spread their learning throughout the semester rather than only doing it when they anticipate some form of assessment. Another impact of assessment is that it inhibits cooperation and collaboration between students. We tell students you mustn't collude with each other. You mustn't cheat. That is wrong. And of course it is wrong. But the students find it very difficult to distinguish between what is wrong in terms of cooperation and what is good in terms of cooperation. We need students to graduate that are very good at working with other people. Employers say that's what they want from our graduates. So how do we deal with this problem in assessment where we say you mustn't collude with students, but on the other hand, you must cooperate with them? There are mixed messages here, which we need to help them with. And of course, assessment overemphasizes some skills at the expense of others. So I don't know what it's like in your context, but traditionally, assessments have emphasized handwriting. Our mid-semester assignments are written on computers. People write them on screens. But examinations are still typically done in handwriting. In the world of work, very little handwriting for extended periods of time occurs. An awful lot of time is spent communicating verbally with other people. And typically our assessment practices don't value that. And of course, finally, it has an impact on students because it distracts them from the object of study through a focus on marks and grades. Students ask questions like, how can I get a better mark? When my students ask me that question, I refuse to answer. I say to them, if you want to ask me, how can I produce better work? I will answer you. If you formulate it in terms of better grades, I won't, because I want you to focus on what's really important, and that's the quality of your work, not just the way in which it gets graded. So these are the three key purposes of assessment. And these are the three things that assessment always needs to do. And what I want to do is to structure my presentation around looking at each one of these in turn. So the first one of these is assurance. Assessment is about assuring that learning outcomes have been met. Some people talk about that in terms of certification, certifying that students have met the standard. Sometimes the word summative assessment is used, but that's all about assurance. Can students do the things that we claim they should be able to do if they graduate from this course? The second one is about enabling students to use information to aid their learning now. So assurance comes towards the end, enabling students goes all the way through. So are we providing information to students that would enable them during the semester, whilst they're still enrolled in your particular subject or your particular unit, to improve their work so that by the end, they will have met the appropriate standard? And that is often called formative assessment, and it often involves feedback. Feedback is one of the key things we do in that area. And the third thing, which I mentioned earlier, is assessment is always about building students' capacity to judge their own learning. It isn't good enough if we, as teachers, know how good a student is. The student needs to know for themselves. Unless they know for themselves what they can do and can't do, they can't continue their own study appropriately, and they can't do good work in the world. And this purpose of assessment has been labelled sustainable assessment. So let's look at these. So I'm going to start with the first one about assurance, and then say some things about that, and then move on. There'll be a break for discussion after I've talked about assurance. Now, one of the things that we have learned to do over the last 20 years or so, and for some countries it's really only been in the last 10 years, is that we've learned to use the currency of learning outcomes to describe what we are trying to do. In earlier years, we used words like syllabus or course content. That valued what we were putting into students. It didn't focus on what students should be able to do. So the language of learning outcomes has been adopted right around the world now to describe what it is that students should be able to do once they've successfully completed a course. These are the representations of academic standards. And because it's something that we need the students to be able to do, it must be expressed in terms of what the student can and cannot do. And we often express these at both the overall program level, that's for the whole degree program, and we express them at the subject level or the course unit level. And increasingly they have serious outcomes. And this varies a bit from country to country at the moment. And certainly in Australia, if we state a learning outcome, we are obliged to assure it. So if we say in our public information about a course, these are the learning outcomes, we are obliged to also assure that graduates have these learning outcomes, have met the appropriate standard. And this is just a bit of local information from the Australian context. I know nothing about what your own context is, and different countries are in different places on this. But let me look at these are our higher education standards, and our universities have to meet these standards if they are continued to be registered as universities. And in that last paragraph there, I'll read it out. Methods of assessment are consistent with the learning outcomes being assessed, okay? So we've got to assess students in a way that's consistent with the learning outcomes. That's quite straightforward. We can all do that. But they are also capable of confirming that all specified learning outcomes are achieved. All specified learning outcomes are achieved. So if we state it, we need to assure it. And the grades or award reflect the level of attainment. So we might have been doing this in 2015, but an awful lot of other countries I've noticed in their quality frameworks are starting to introduce this idea. If you state a learning outcome, you need to assure that the students have met it. And this might only mean meeting it at the minimum level. Students will get extra grades for meeting it at higher level. So what are the implications of assessment for this focus on learning outcomes? Well, assessment is about judging whether students can demonstrate the attainment of a particular learning outcome to a particular standard. And that means we must set a standard for each assessment task. It can't be general, it has to relate to each task. Each task has its own standard. Now, the same standard might be applied to some different tasks, but in general, that will vary. And the important thing about this is setting a pass mark is not setting a standard. It doesn't do the work because we can move the pass mark too easily. We actually have to set the standard in terms of what is the minimum a student needs in order to pass, and what is the level of performance a student needs to attain higher grades. So it's not just a matter of having a general set of standards, we need to have them very particular. And a very, very important implication of this is that a student can't compensate for bad performance on one learning outcome by superior performance on another. And the common thing that we used to do is that we used to have an examination which covered all the learning outcomes, and we used to average the marks across different learning outcomes and set a pass mark. That is no longer acceptable. We have to say, has the student met this particular learning outcome? In a given subject, there might be 3 or 4 or 5 learning outcomes. We need to assure each one. And in particular, we have to assure that a student has met all of them, at least at the minimum level, and that's at the pass level. And that means that all assessment must be based upon standards. Norm referencing, that is judging students against each other, is banned. It is completely inappropriate in the international context that we now have for assessment in higher education. We need learning outcomes, and when learning outcomes have standards associated with them, and assessment tasks have criteria, students have to meet these criteria, and it doesn't vary according to the nature of the student group. In the past, if we had a good group of students one year and a poor group of students the next year, academic standards varied from year to year. It was just not good. Now we are having assessment which is standards-based. We must set the standard and ensure that students meet that standard. So, on that perhaps controversial point, I'm going to pause for discussion and ask Majid to see if there's some questions that need to be asked. Let me look at the chat myself. I will let you choose the question to ask, so that
yeah, so
you're
far
more
there is
familiar
no
with the
question, but
context.
there is there's no question so far. Dr. Junaid is not sure it's a comment or a, this is the first yeah, from Dr. Junaid. You have already raised all the interesting question in your initial comments. To begin with, I'm keen to know how we can make assessments based on questions which are similar to what one encounters in the real life.
That's a good question, and I'm going to answer that in the next sequence when I talk about authentic assessment. The other thing is that I want you to work hard. This is a workshop. This is not you listening to me.
Yeah.
This is a workshop in which you as participants have to do things. Right? And I want to respond to what your needs are rather than you just listening to where I'm coming from. So please question what I'm saying, raise issues. I think there's some more questions here. How do we engage students in the culture of assessment? I'm not entirely sure what you mean by the culture of assessment. If you mean the ways of doing assessment that I'm talking about now, there are a number of things we have to do. One of the things I've already touched upon, and that is I refuse to talk to my students about marks and grades. Because when we talk to students about marks and grades, we distract them from learning the real thing and we get them to focus on marks and grades. So I won't engage in that discussion. What I will engage in is a discussion about how you will improve your work. What is the standard of your work now, and how can you shift it to the level that you want it to be? So that's one thing that we can do to create a culture, an appropriate culture for assessment. The other thing we can do is that we can emphasize to students that it doesn't matter how good or how poorly your fellow students will do. That doesn't matter. It's between you and the standards that you have to meet. So it's down to you. You know, you're not going to do better just by beating your colleague. You're going to do better because you actually meet the standard. I'm just going to touch on a few of these here. Assessment based on standards rather than marks. Well, okay, that's a good one. When we talk about assessment, assessment is never based on marks. Marks are just the currency we use. So when we talk about standards, we are saying that this is the learning outcome, and there are various levels at which you can meet it as a student. The minimum level is what we call the pass level. So this is the minimum we can accept a student's work to be if they want to successfully meet that learning outcome. And there will be some levels above that. And at the levels above that, they will get a higher grade. So that if we're talking about learning outcome number one, then learning outcome number one will have a number of grades associated with it, but it's not the grade that's important. The grade is purely a summary of the standard that the student has reached within their performance.
There is a hand raised by, I think, Dr. Khola.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for touching upon a very important aspect. I'll go back to standards, and if you don't mind, could you please operationally define what standard means to you because it might mean something different to me or to other listeners. This is one. And the second one is, again, if it means what it means to me, at least. Now, when we measure the learning outcome against student performance and against program learning outcomes, we come across something in some universities where they said you have to have like 60 or 65 as an achievement rate or whatever. And if the students pass that one, then you've done well. If not, then not you, the students, they've done well. If not, then they haven't done well. So I need to know exactly how we can decide that. Would it be decided for each learning outcome, or would it be decided for the whole course? Because the practice now is 65 for the whole course, for example, or 70 for the whole course.
Yeah, we've moved away from that. Yeah. It has to be for each learning outcome.
Okay, now, but how do we decide exactly the pass or the standards for each learning outcome? Based on what? What's your criteria?
Well, you have to set the criteria for each particular task.
So it's me who decides on that.
Pardon?
It's the teacher who decides that. It's the one who is giving the assessment, not the institution.
Well, it's not the teacher alone. So, for example, if they're program learning outcomes, it's the whole program. And sometimes those programs are accredited by external bodies. Mm-hmm. So those external bodies will also have an input into those learning outcomes. Right.
That's what I wanted to know. Thank you.
Yep.
Dr. Ibrahim?
Okay, I have the same question as my previous colleague, which is basically when we assess these learning outcomes, we put an average for each question or the collection of questions that pertain or related to that learning outcomes. We decide an average, for example, of students' performance at 60% or 65%. This is what we usually do here, okay? But I understand from from our speakers that really this is not the right way, okay? Am I getting you correct or not? Okay.
Yes, we're moving away. I'm not saying that there's huge numbers of institutions that are doing it the way I'm describing, but this is the direction that everyone is moving in. And what I mean by that is that we have to be very careful that we don't average inappropriately. So if there are, let's say there are 3 learning outcomes in the subject that you're teaching. Each one of those we need to assure. What is the standard? What is the level for each one of those? So we should be reporting by performance on those learning outcomes, not by averaging all 3 and producing 1 mark. And the other thing we need to be careful not to do is that when we do this across a whole program, we should only be averaging elements that are in particular course learning outcomes. So, for example, if there's a whole degree program and there might be 10 learning outcomes for the whole degree, then there will be 10 representations. And within each one of those 10, there will be marks from or grades from previous courses which you can average, but you can't average across those different learning outcomes. That is not a meaningful thing to do. Is that sufficient?
Maybe we'll talk later on about it. Just we'll have to wait for a while. I can delay my other questions for later on.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
So there's lots of questions, Mojib, but are there any questions which you think it will be good for me to answer now?
They are all good, but I think maybe you need to progress. Then we can answer them as we go along. As you go along, you can answer them. Yes.
Okay. Can you keep an eye on them and see which ones are appropriate?
Yes, sure. Yes.
So these were some questions I had for you, just in case you didn't have any questions for me. Okay. So what else drives this? Okay. So this is an old quote. This is from nearly 20 years ago, but I'm sure if we ask the students now, they'd say very similar things. And what Striven and colleagues said, this is I think it's in the Netherlands or Belgium. Many students perceive traditional learning tasks as arbitrary and irrelevant. They only aim to learn for the purposes of a particular assessment with no intention of maintaining the knowledge for the longer term. And over time, there's been endless studies in which students have taken a test or an examination. They've been tested a week later, 2 weeks later, the end of the vacation, and the level of knowledge retention has dropped dramatically. So we need to be very careful that our tests and examinations are not creating this very, very bad behavior. And the bad behavior is you learn for it now and then you forget. So we need to be thinking about assessment as promoting and having a very positive backwash on students' learning. Now, one of the things that's been introduced, or maybe it's just the language of authentic assessment that's been introduced in recent years. And the argument about authentic assessment is that students will engage in assessment if they see that it is meaningful. If they can see assessment is them doing tasks that they could imagine themselves doing in the world of work, they're more likely to positively engage with the assessment task and regard it as meaningful and not just learn it for the immediate test and then forget it. So what was the problem? The problem is that students don't see the point of what they're learning. They see assessment as an artificial exercise, jumping through a hoop like this cartoon, and they don't think it's meaningful. They don't think our courses are sufficiently aligned to the world of practice. It's probably different in your context because you've got very vocational courses. And program learning outcomes are ignored at the expense of particular subject matter. So that was the problem. And authentic assessment tasks are characterized by realism. They're linked to everyday life and work. They're contextualized. It's not an extraction of a piece of knowledge to some artificial situation, but they have to apply what they know in a context. They have to know things, of course, but what's important is not the knowing of something, but the application of that to a real situation. And that's the problematization. What is learned can be used to solve a problem or meet a need. And it's not a problem or a need that their teacher has. It's a problem or a need that exists in the world that people that are graduates in their particular area will need to help people meet. Now that's authentic assessment. And one of the challenges, how do we actually start to orient our assessment to be more authentic? And one of the ways of doing that is thinking about who the audience is. If the audience only appears to be the marker, then it's not authentic. So authentic assessment tasks are directed to someone for some purpose beyond the exercise itself. Now, of course, that might not be for real. This just might be the way the task is set up. It might still be the teacher that marks it, but that it is formulated in a way that meets an external need. So give you an example. Typically, a student might be asked to write an essay about a particular topic. Essays about a particular topic only exist in the educational world. People in the real world, very, 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 very few of them ever write essays about things. So how do we recontextualize that piece of writing on that topic to make it authentic? So there's all sorts of things. You can formulate it as, well, you need to write a report to the managing director of this organization about this particular issue. That's the way of starting to frame it in an authentic way. Or you need to write a letter to the local newspaper talking about this thing which has become the subject of some controversy locally. And what that does is it reframes someone's knowledge in terms of getting them to think about how that knowledge might be applied, how it might be used, how might they communicate that knowledge to someone other than their teacher, because they know their teacher knows this stuff already, because they wrote the questions. So it's a matter of that kind of reformulation is one of the things we need to think about in terms of authenticity. So trying to imagine an authentic audience, even if there isn't a real one. However, as students progress through their degrees, it is important to find a real authentic audience. So one of the things that we're increasingly seeing is students doing things which they post on the web, and they get feedback for real from real practitioners or for whatever. So the lecturer is just a surrogate for the real audience. And we might need to think about how we can bring in some real audiences to appreciate that, particularly in later years. So authentic isn't an absolute, it's a direction that we move in. So you can't say this is perfectly authentic task, because a perfectly authentic task is probably too messy and too complicated and too time consuming for students to do as an assessment task. So we have the challenge of shaping a real world task into something that's of a sufficient size and magnitude that students can engage in. So there are two directions we can take for development. We can start with our existing tasks and our existing examples that we use and make them more authentic. That's one way we can do it. Or my preference is to start with authentic examples from practice and see how they can be adapted to the constraints of a course. And throughout, we need to focus on what students do and what they produce. Are the students doing something to meet a real need? Or do they believe it meets a real need? I mean, that need has probably been met already in most of these tasks, but the students don't need to know that. Are they involved in an authentic process? Not just an authentic product, but is the process they're going through an authentic one? So, for example, in data engineering, one of the things the data engineers do in the real world is they actually try out their code on each other all the time, absolutely all the time. So they write some code and they get someone else to read their code. So an authentic assessment task in data engineering is writing code and having other people check it and adapting accordingly. So we need to ask ourselves, how can tasks better reflect what a practitioner might do? And are there ways of organizing real world responses? Can we enlist the aid of some people out there in the world to be receptive to these tasks? So another pause for discussion. Are there any things in the chat, Mujib, that
we have
what I've been saying?
Yes, we have few questions in the chat. If you want to start with these few questions. The question posted earlier by Dr. Junaid: how can we make assessment based on questions which are similar or similar to what one encounters in real life? It seems like, how can I link the assessments to the real life practices? Is it the matter of alignment, for example, of assessment task with the learning outcomes, assuming that the learning outcomes are already aligned with the real world practices, or it's the direct alignment with by ignoring maybe the learning outcomes and just align directly the assessment task with the actual practice?
No, we mustn't ignore the learning outcomes are central. They're the given thing that the whole course is organized around. Now, when we develop them in order to meet real world outcomes, but that's one phase we do at the start. So we've got the learning outcomes and we know, because we've been through a suitable process, that these are the learning outcomes suitable for a graduate in that area. We then need to ask ourselves, what are the tasks that students need to do in order over time and over different units of study to reach those learning outcomes? So, for example, one of these big program level learning outcomes, it might be developed in 6 different units. So that will be assessed in 6 different ways. And in one of those units, you will be focusing on creating an authentic assessment task, which is completely and totally aligned with the learning outcome, but also reflects some real world activity. So that might be the way to do it.
There is another question here also. Do you think the approach of running for higher grade could be changed by emphasizing on the importance of the learning outcomes and what student should be able or will be able to do? Meaning that it's like we want to indicate to students somehow through the assessment, we are emphasizing the knowledge, not the grade. And can this assessment help us in this direction?
In research, that's the bit I don't quite get. Where's the research come in? I'm not sure I understand that. I'm trying to look for that question in the chat.
Yeah, it is.
How far down is it?
Let me just check it. Yeah, it is by Ria at 10:40.
10:40. Good. 10:40 is good.
My time, our time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's all sorts of different questions in that question. So I'm finding it difficult to, if Ria wants to come in and ask that by putting her hand up, then please do so.
You could not find it. I can copy it and.
No, I found the question, but
okay.
I'm having difficulty interpreting it.
Okay, so yeah.
But please, Ria, come and ask that question yourself. So.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, let me just move to the next question here.
Hi, Professor.
Hello.
This is Ria here. Can I
go ahead?
Do you want
Yes.
me to? Yeah. Should I just?
Can you just explain your question? Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So what I would like to understand is like I've been teaching in the UK and UAE both, right? And a lot of assessments and questions that I'm seeing there in the UAE are limiting the opportunity for the student to demonstrate, skills that they would normally need at, as a professional. So do you think that there should be standardization or a body or a regulator that should normally, assess, what types of assessments or assessment instruments are used so that it could help, the students, to acquire the, all the skills that are, needed, instead of just simply answering question, just giving answers to questions like theoretical questions, and actually there is no takeaway. So they would just memorize those and, just write down the answers, and then they just want to know what are their grades. So this is something that, there's a, I think this approach should be changed. So what could be done in that case?
Well, I think that the university needs to fix that itself. Now, it's very important that we take notice of professional bodies and we take notice of industry, but it's our responsibility to create those tasks. It's our responsibility to create that assessment. So there does need to be some investigation within the university about that. And what I see is that increasingly universities have various kind of processes and internal bodies that help staff review their assessment practices to make them more effective in the way that you're suggesting they need to be. So I'm worried about standardization across the board. And some professional bodies very much like to do that. But for most courses, it is a responsibility of the university. And most universities would much prefer external bodies not to get involved too closely. And if they want to avoid being controlled by external parties, they need to make the reform themselves. Thank you, Rhea, for that question.
Thank you.
Okay, there's one question here also. What aspects of authentic task you may elaborate on so we can apply it in our classrooms?
Well, I mean, I try to give you a bit of a steer on that. So what we're looking at is go out in the world, in your subject area, people out there doing those things in practice. What are the tasks that they face? What are the challenges that they meet? Now, one of the big reforms that occurred in medical education when they moved towards problem-based learning is they started their investigation by going out into the world of medical practice, and they asked the question, what are the most common medical issues that new doctors face when they first graduate? And they organized the curriculum around an analysis of what doctors in their early years would face in medical practice. And that led them to design problems that students worked on. So the thing that I would encourage you to do is go out there and see what people are doing and bring some of those ideas back in and use those as the basis for assessment tasks. Now, you may have to modify them a little because they might be too long or too complicated, or they might require, certain kinds of information that students don't have. But that should be the starting point. Build upon those examples.
Let's take this last one, and then maybe we'll move forward. In what basis we set the minimum standard for each learning outcomes if it's not just a pass one?
Well, the minimum is a pass. There is anything below the minimum standard is a fail. So that's the clear lower.
No, I think the question may be targeting or trying to ask about if it's not about the grade, if it's about the knowledge, as we said, or measuring the actual knowledge. What is the minimum standard maybe for this knowledge?
Well, you have to specify that. I mean, that's the each one of the levels of performance. Say you've got 4 passing grades. Each one of those will have an indication of what the student needs to be able to do to meet that level of performance. So there are criteria that are applied to judge whether the student has met the performance of this grade or this grade or this grade. But you have to specify that for each assessment task or for each learning outcome in association with each assessment task.
Okay.
There is a good question here from Akram. Authentic tasks often don't measure the specific task and requires a more general understanding and analysis before using specific skills. Most teachers avoid authentic tasks in favor of measuring specific technical skills. I agree with that. Can you comment on how authentic tasks given to students that are based on practical ways of solving problems are better than targeting the specific skill? Well, what a lot of people do is that they say, one of the things that people are trying to avoid doing is in their summative assessment, that is assessment for assurance, they're trying to get rid of all that memorization work. However, often a lot of memorization is needed in order to be able to tackle an authentic task. So where does that sit? Where does that memorization work sit? And how do we help students meet those requirements? Now, typically people are using online environments to provide students with self-tests in which they test themselves to make sure they have met the knowledge level before they deal with those more complicated, authentic tasks. And this requires a shift of thinking. It requires a shift of thinking on the part of students is, well, I've got to make sure I reach the standard myself, because if I don't make the standard myself, then I'm going to do very, very badly when I meet an authentic task. So we need to think about not just the task itself, which may occur late in the semester. We must think also about what are the elements that students need to have learned earlier in order to effectively tackle that task. And that then moves in our thinking into the area of formative assessment, which is my next topic, which I might move on to, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Right. So we talked about assessment for assurance, and this is about assuring learning outcomes have been met. The next area is to enable students to use information to aid their learning now. So that's our focus. And a big focus of this is feedback. And feedback is one of the areas in which there's been a massive transformation in thinking in universities over the last 8 years or so. Traditionally, we thought of feedback as information we give to students once they've completed some kind of assignment. Okay, so they hand something in and they get comments from us about their work. And we've typically labeled that feedback. And that's been important because it helps guide students for what they need to do to meet our assurance assessment. Okay, so we provide formative information. So by the end of the course unit, then they can meet the learning outcomes. But the shift has occurred from being the teacher-centric view, and that is an emphasis on the kind of comments that teachers make, to a learning-centric view, which is what do students need to be able to do to benefit from inputs from others? And this is turning the whole thing on its head, because feedback is not something that teachers can do only by themselves. All that we can do, in one sense, is to provide information. Most of the other parts of the feedback process are the responsibility of the student. So the student has to take that information, the student has to make sense of it, the student has to kind of learn something, and then they need some future task in which they can apply that understanding to a future task. So this is the shift that's occurred from feedback as an input to seeing feedback as a process in which students necessarily have to be involved. They still need comments from us, but the comments from us is only a part of an overall feedback process. Now, we did a very big national project in Australia a few years ago, and we looked at 2 very large universities, and we were looking for what is really, really good feedback practice. If somebody's doing it really, really well, what would it look like? So one of the parts of this project is we then had to find a definition of feedback. And we obviously thought, well, we just read the literature. I mean, there'd be all sorts of good definitions of feedback in the literature. And we were very, very disappointed because the definitions of feedback we thought were pretty useless. In particular, the definition of feedback focused on what teachers did, not what learners did. And in fact, they left out learners altogether. So this is the definition that we came up with in our project, and that's been used in a number of studies since. So a lot of people have taken this up. So the definition goes, feedback is a process. Okay, it's a process. It isn't a single input. It's a process in which learners make sense of information. That is, the learners need to do something with the information they receive from others. And the information they receive from others is about their performance. So this isn't general information that we might give out in a lecture or a seminar. This is information about their specific performance on a task. So the learners need to make sense of the information, and they need to use that information to enhance the quality of their work or the quality of their learning strategies. That is the way in which they approach tasks. So feedback is, in this definition, something that learners need to be engaged in right from the start. So they don't just get dumped with a whole lot of information from us and they say, well, you know, I'm not quite sure what to do with this, or you know, just give me the grade or whatever. We need to kind of enlist them in a view of feedback that involves them very strongly. And this, of course, is not feedback. It might have been the old view of feedback, and it might be the view of feedback that's embodied in certain national student surveys, because we did a paper about this, but we don't think that's an appropriate way of thinking about feedback now. Now, this project we did, and this is just a picture from our website. And if you want to go and have a look at this, there's some really, really useful resources here. And the URL is feedbackforlearning.org. So we took a survey of over 4,500 students in these two universities, and we did a survey and we interviewed them with the focus groups. And what we were looking for was the subjects in which the students reported the very, very best feedback practices, the very, very best that they'd experienced. And then what we did is we identified, we got a list, and we looked at the ones that right at the top of the list, the ones that the most students referred to as being really good. And then we interviewed the staff, the teaching staff, we interviewed students, we examined exactly what the staff were doing when they did feedback, and we created some case studies, some of which are available on our website. And we've got 7 case studies on our website. Don't worry about the subject matter. That's of less interest. What's interesting here is the way people did it. And we didn't just take the ones at the top of the list. We said, what are the really difficult situations in which to do feedback? And difficult situations are first-year classes and classes that are very large. And in Australia, when we talk about a large class, we're talking about a class of more than 1,000 students. That's large for us. And we reckon if you can do it with 1,000 students, you can easily do it with 50 or 100. That's, you know, that's small things to do. So if you go to our website, you can actually look at these case studies about how you can provide a feedback effectively in challenging circumstances. And one of the things that they share in common is that they all use a multitude of different ways of doing it. They all integrate it very, very carefully into assessment and into their courses. And they, in the larger classes, they train their tutors to give feedback and they moderate the quality of feedback. So for example, in the, I think it's the second one here, this is a class of about 1,500 students, which is offered on 4 campuses and also in the cloud. And the person that runs this course, this course unit, has a team of 30 tutors. And what she does is that the students hand in the work and they get feedback on it, and the feedback is audio feedback. The tutor records a little file and they send it back to the student. But the person in charge monitors the quality of the feedback. So each tutor has to give an acceptable quality feedback comment before they're allowed to give comments to any more than one student. So that's a way of moderating the quality of feedback. So if you look at these case studies, you can go into feedbackforlearning.org, have a look at those. There are videos, there are resources, there are handouts, all sorts of things there, which I hope will stimulate you to think about alternatives. Now, let's just touch on a few really, really important things about feedback. most of the things we do with students apply to every single student in the same way. Same learning outcomes, same tasks, same lectures, same criteria we use to judge their work, and so on and so forth. So we treat all students identically. And we do that for very good reasons of equity. We shouldn't discriminate between students. However, there's a big problem here. For learning purposes, we must discriminate between students because every student is different from every other student. And the only way in which we can tailor the course to individual students are through some of the very few processes associated with feedback. So feedback is one of the few ways in which we give different information to different students. And we need to do that because students have individual needs. So we need to think very carefully about how we design them, and giving comments to students is only a part of a feedback process, very important part, but it's only a part of it. Without active engagement from students, feedback information can't influence learning. So we've got to think about ways of engaging students. And we need to complete that feedback loop. And that is, we must think of opportunities for students to learn from the feedback in order to apply it later within the same course unit. And we need to think about feedback as judging the quality of feedback, not on whether it's right or not, because I can write comments to students that is wonderful, detailed, fluent, but that's not good enough. I need to think about how am I going to write something to students which is actually going to influence them to do something. I need to do it in such a way that leads to their action, that motivates them. So our inputs need always to be judged in terms of their effects on student learning. Now, if you want to follow up feedback, I've been involved in various books. Here are two ones here. And at the end of this presentation, which is freely available, I've sent a copy to Mujib, which will make it available to you, the whole lot of references as well. So there's a lot going on about feedback at the moment and different ways of doing it, how you do it in different circumstances, feedback design and so on. But whilst we're still on feedback, let me make a really, really important distinction. And the distinction I want to make is between the justification of a mark and feedback information. Now, typically, we provide students the feedback after they've done a task. And when they've done a task, we often grade the task. And as I talked about earlier, we grade it in terms of their performance against standards and learning outcomes. So there are typically two things we provide to students. First of all is the mark, and there's a justification of the mark. So the justification of the mark, it basically explains why they've been allocated this particular level. And we often use rubrics as a way of kind of communicating that level. But the mark justification is essentially a backward-looking process. It's looking to what students have already done. Feedback, however, is essentially a forward-looking process about what students can do. Now, we need to be not distracted by the English word feedback, because the word back in feedback suggests you're looking back. But ironically, feedback is always about looking forward. So be very careful not to be distracted by the back in feedback. Some people have been distracted by that word so much, they've invented a new one called feed forward. I think somebody has their...
Yes, please. Yeah, okay.
So feedback information is about what students can do to improve their work, what students can do to more effectively meet their learning outcomes. So feedback is always forward-looking, and mark justification is always backward-looking. You did this, you got this mark, and the reason for it is this. That is not feedback. Feedback is, this is the work you've done. We're looking forward. What you need to do, the kind of things you need to engage in is this. So let's keep that distinction in mind. And very often we spend too much time on mark justification and not enough time on providing feedback information, which is looking forward. Now, just in passing, I just want to mention the idea that written feedback isn't the only way we can do it. Some people use group comments. That is, they make a presentation of the students, they've marked all their work, and they talk about, well, you know, there was this common problem that some students had and not this problem. Students like it, but they don't think it's feedback because it doesn't relate to their individual work. So it might be a reasonable thing to do, but it doesn't meet the full feedback need. We can meet students individually and we can kind of communicate with them on a one-to-one basis. But unfortunately, we normally don't have time to do it for everyone. And when we make it voluntary, when we say to students, oh, well, I have these office hours, come and see me in office hours, this is a real problem. And the problem is not that you're not there in your office. The problem is the wrong students come to talk to you. The students who come to talk to you are the ones that least need your feedback input. So we need to think about feedback in terms of how do we get it to all students, particularly the ones that need it most. And the two things that are rising in popularity enormously at the moment is video or audio comments. Audio comments might be more appropriate in your culture, I don't know. But the idea is that you have the students' work in front of you and you speak to it and you comment on it and you say, hello, James, you know, I've just been reading your work. I noticed this, you did that. I'd like to draw your attention to that. So you have in a sense, a one-way conversation with them, which you're recording on your laptop. So you record yourself and you have a little commentary on their work. Now, that has a number of advantages. One advantage is that the student thinks you're communicating with them individually, whereas and that they know that you know them. You might not know them a great deal. All you know is their name and the work, but the students feel as if they're involved in the process much more than with written comments. The other thing is you can actually get across a lot more useful information and with a lot more emphasis and nuance and direct them a bit more when you're speaking than when it is written. And the big payoff is that it saves time. You can actually say more useful things and spend less overall time on students' work when you're speaking feedback information rather than when you're writing it. And whenever you write it, it becomes more formal. And the student misses out the stress and the emphasis when it's written and when it's spoken. So I'd very strongly recommend, there's a whole lot of papers coming out recently about the value of this. And people are taking it up because it saves them time. One variation on this is screencasting, and that is that you make audio comments, as I've described, but then you annotate their work. So in technical areas where you're dealing with equations or diagrams or some kind of visual representations, a screencast enables you to draw on their work and make comments as well. So the idea is not that you write out your comments. That's not the point. The thing is that you can put arrows in, you can make links between this and that. You can draw lines around particular equations and say, well, this is the bit that you need to focus on and things of that kind. So that's just by way of adding to our repertoire of comments. Now, I said I'm not going to offer tips for teachers, but I thought I'd leave this slide, put this slide in this presentation, because what I want to do is to challenge you challenge you to take on any 2 or 3 or 4 of these points and see whether it makes a difference. Because I reckon by taking on some of these points, you can make a substantial difference to the quality of feedback in your courses. Now, I'm going to leave that with you, so I'm not going to go through it in detail. But 1 or 2 things I'd like to point out. Well, I'm going to talk about the first few of them. So first thing to think about is you have a task, students get feedback information, they work out what to do with it, and then where does it land? So you need to think about how you design your course in terms of the students learn from feedback, but where is it directed? Is there some subsequent task that they can do in which they can demonstrate that they've learned from it? So we need to think about what are the different tasks that go through a course within a semester. And our semesters are quite short. We can't have too many, but we need to think about them in terms of where does that information land? Second one here, and this is the quickest and easiest payoff, can I suggest? I don't know what it's like in your university, but in most Australian universities, when students hand in work, well, they don't hand it in, they hand it in electronically. They have to complete a cover sheet in which they make a statement saying, this is my own work, it satisfies the requirements of this task. And sometimes they have to sign a statement saying that, you know, that they haven't cheated or something like that. Add a box to the cover sheet, and in the box, the students say, what kind of feedback information would they find really helpful? Now, when you first introduce this, the students tend to put in things like, well, whatever you think might be helpful to me. And you say, no. Right, I can't give you helpful information unless you say what is going to be most helpful. And in the process of doing that, we are starting to actively involve students in the feedback process. And we're also getting students to guide us in terms of all the comments that we might possibly make about their work. We need to make sure we address the one that they really most want comments about. Because I don't know about you, but often I'm reading students' work and there are 10 things I want to say about it. Now, well, I don't have time to write down 10 things, so I write down some of them. If I knew the kind of things that students would find most helpful for me to focus on, then I'd make sure that they were ones that I absolutely included in the comments that I make. And the third one here, and you can read the rest later, is have students respond to feedback information with a plan for what they're going to do about it. So you send off your feedback information to them. I'm assuming it's all done electronically now. And they have to post back a little statement. Doesn't need to be very long. I'm going to do this, this, and this. And the whole point of doing that is not for you to monitor it and check up on it, but it's a nudge for them to think about the need to process and work with the useful information you've provided. So I will leave that. Have we come to another break? Yes, there's another break. I might leave this on the screen whilst we go to discussion, just in case you want to read about some of the others. So let's have a look at the chat again. So where do you want to start, Najib?
Do you want a specific interaction from the audience answering some of the questions in the next, for example, discussion? Do you know something? Or
yes, I was just going to leave it on so they could read it while the other discussion is going on, but I'm not too worried about these questions.
Okay. So we have a question here, which is asking about the role of the course design. The question says, course design is very important. Can you reflect on course design at your university?
It depends on whether you're referring to course design or course unit design, or so that there's the program level, which is all the elements that make up a degree, and we call them course units, which are the individual elements.
I think here the unit, maybe it's called in Australia the unit. I think, yeah, the course, we call it course here.
The course, course, yeah, okay. So for the course, the most important thing about the course is that it is nested within the program. So the very, very first thing that's important in course design is looking at the learning outcomes for the program as a whole and being really, really, really clear about where your course fits into the overall process. So one of the things that is commonly done is a strategy called curriculum mapping. And what curriculum mapping does is it takes the overall learning outcomes for the program and looks at each course, and it identifies where are the program learning outcomes being pursued, which courses do that. And then you identify which courses do it, and then you identify what are the assessments that assure that within that course unit. You can then go down to the process of, so these are the things that assure it. What are the feedback processes that need to fit in to that course unit to mean that students are able to attain that outcome? So that will be a kind of a crude, simplistic way of describing course design, but I'd be happy to elaborate on any aspects of that.
Okay.
Now, of course, before I move on, of course, this is what's recommended. We still have all the history of people that designed their courses many years ago on a whole different set of principles, and they don't fit in very well when we do the curriculum mapping. This provides a challenge for us. And one of the things that we have to do is that, well, one of the reasons we use curriculum mapping is to point out to teaching staff that their course doesn't fit very well, and they've got to do something about making their course fit the program. And it might involve changing their learning outcomes. It may involve changing their assessment. It may involve changing their feedback. It may involve changing the timing of tasks, whatever. But we do that collectively so that people can see where their contribution fits into the whole.
There is also another question here saying, did you explore uptake in language learning for feedback?
What number is that? What time is that? Can I just read it?
Let me go back to it.
Is this about feedback in language learning?
I think it's yes, in language learning, yes.
Okay. I haven't had much experience in language learning, so I can just talk about general terms. The thing about language learning is that feedback is something that they're very familiar with and has been used over very, very long periods of time. So some of the things that I'm talking about are more familiar to people in language learning than they are in learning, technical subjects or science and engineering. But one of the things that we need to think about in language learning is that there is a role for correction, but there's also an important role for students taking responsibility and setting their own goals and setting their own directions. So we need to be careful in language learning on the feedback front that we don't overemphasize corrective feedback. There is a place for that, and make sure that we pay enough attention to this forward-looking feedback processes that I've been discussing. One of my doctoral students is just completing, and she's been working in feedback in language learning, and two of the papers in the reference list at the end, her name is Maleka. So look for the name Maleka in the reference list. And they're two examples of someone from language learning using some of these ideas. And she uses the idea of ipsative processes. So what she means by that is that we're looking at what an individual student can do over time. So it's referencing their performance now to their performance previously. So it's about moving them forward piece by piece, which I think is a more of a language learning strategy than it is in some other areas.
Okay. What are your thoughts about feedback from student to teacher?
Students to teachers, it is something we have to live with, is one response. We've actually written a paper recently about where feedback fits in on these student surveys. And we've identified, and we surveyed, I think it was 20 different countries that had national student surveys. And the feedback questions are normally bad questions because they assume feedback is an input. And what typically happens in almost all countries is assessment and feedback is the worst rated aspect of performance across disciplines, across universities, across countries. And we suggest that one of the reasons why feedback comes out so badly is because the concept of feedback embedded in these questionnaires is a poor one. But in general, I think it is appropriate for students to comment both about us as teachers and about courses. So, for example, at Deakin, we are obliged, whenever we write an outline for a course, which has the learning outcomes, the assessment tasks, the timing, and all that information that students get up front. One of the things that we have to include in that is how has this course changed as a result of previous student feedback about it? So this is a way of us showing that we do take students' comments seriously, and it has led to improvements in what we're doing now. So I'm not sure if anyone has a very specific question about feedback to teachers, but
yeah, this was the question. But there is also another, maybe again another question, which is, can students students who don't need feedback, can they help students who really need feedback? And how effective is this?
This is a very good question. It's about peer feedback. Peer feedback is a very, very useful process, and I'll be saying a bit more about that later. The one thing that we know, though, is that when students give feedback information to each other, the person that learns most is the person giving the feedback information, not the person receiving it. So we need to think about that. The person giving information has a very important task. They have to take account of what the other student has done. They have to think about the information they want to convey. They have to draw upon their own knowledge of the subject, and they have to communicate that very clearly to the other person. This is a fantastically good learning task, right? Even if it had nothing to do with feedback, it will be worth doing. Getting students to articulate their understanding of something to another person is a very, very valuable activity. So that's one of the reasons why peer feedback is important. In terms of the information that the recipient gets, then that can be useful. It's not as useful as we think it's going to be, or they think it's going to be, but it is useful. But one of the things we need to do is we need to train students on giving and receiving feedback information. So just letting them loose, and so we'll just do it, just give comments to each other. It will work with some students, and some students will be very good at doing it amongst their friends often. But if we want to do it systematically, we do have to provide some kind of training in how you do it well.
Okay, I think Dr. Jihad has a question, so you can go ahead and speak to the mic, Dr. Jihad.
Thank you, Professor. I was thinking a long time ago that if an artificial intelligence teacher would replace a human teacher in a futuristic situation, if you have only one student, you could teach him, you could look at his work, and you give him detailed comments and so on. But since we are dealing with a large number of students, we cannot do that. And in a perfect AI version of a teacher, I would follow up with the student. I would see his weak points. If it's a physics problem, I would maybe as a AI teacher would identify that his weakness is in the course of algebra that should have been learned 1 year ago, but he didn't. And you could give him a specific recommendations. We cannot do it because it's very costly process. Maybe as the computing progress in the future, it could be done with some guidance, maybe for a selective few as a pilot experiment, then the tool could be generalized to others. I want your comments. Is that even contemplated by some in the educational circles or not? Thank you.
I have to assure you, Jihad, that the future is here. People are experimenting with automated feedback, and colleagues at UTS have developed programs using AI to provide feedback information to students. Students can submit their work into this provision, and they can get feedback information about certain aspects of their work. What we can do at the moment is provide information on some things, but not others. And so there's still a role for the human feedback provider. But what they've managed to do is that they've been applying this to the use of reflective writing. So they now have a system which enables students to submit their reflective writing to this app. And the app will then give them a detailed analysis of the extent to which their writing exhibits reflective characteristics or not. Now, one of the things they're doing is they're trying to extend this to more and more aspects of a student's work. Now, I don't think they're ever going to achieve, achieve feedback across the whole board. But what I think there is a future for is some of our work is going to be offloaded onto AI. It won't replace us, but it will mean that some things AI can do a lot better than us. So, for example, this app just sits there and the student can submit as much writing as they like, as many times as they like. It never gets bored. It always gives them really good information about their writing. So what we will see in the future, I think, is more of this on a slightly broader front than I've just described, but that it will focus our attention on what is that we, the humans, have, what's our best role, what are the things that we can do that the machine can't do. The device they use is called an AccuWriter. So if you want to Google AccuWriter, AccuWriter, then have a look. Does that help?
ACU?
ACU.
And?
AccuWriter.
Just,
so if you look up AccuWriter, UTS, and automated feedback, you'll find it.
Okay. We are in engineering school, and it's kind of we know the weaknesses in general comes from probably some kind of geometry and mathematical deficiencies, and that's not easy to automate using text analysis.
No, but I was shocked when I first came across this idea that it could give students feedback on reflective writing. I didn't believe it, and I went around saying this can't be true until they showed it to me, and I think it actually gives students really good information. So let's see, let's watch this space.
Maybe if you could type in the spelling, that would be great in the chat. ACC or
chat. I'll just write in the chat the
yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
I hope I spelled it correctly, but if you look at yeah, if you put that in Google, then tell me if it works.
I couldn't find it, but maybe you could just pass the spelling later on. Thank you.
Yes, later on we can.
It's in the chat. Yeah, it's sitting there in the chat.
Okay.
What else? Other questions?
So we will pick last question, and then we will proceed.
Yeah, one more, because otherwise we're yeah.
What if the student is not receptive to the feedback? What strategy should be done to improve the feedback process in this case?
If they're not receptive afterwards, it's too late. What we've got to do is we've got to set students up and develop their feedback literacy. And it just so happens the next thing I want to talk about is developing their feedback literacy. So we might move on to that.
Okay, that's it. That's great.
So the question is, what makes feedback work for learners? And basically learners need to understand feedback and how it works. And we need to equip students with the resources they need to make feedback work for them. So the notion of feedback literacy has been described as the understandings, capacities, and disposition needed to make sense of information and use it to enhance work or learning strategies. So what do students need? They need to understand what feedback is, and they need to understand the student-centered version of feedback, because they all know at the moment, oh, feedback is the comments the teachers make on my work. So we've got to move them beyond that. That's the naive view. We need to move them to the naive view as feedback as a process that I've just been talking about. They need practice in making judgments. That's judgments about their own work and the work of others. They need experience in managing their own emotions, because it's very emotional. Some people get feedback and they're devastated by it. So we need to think about that. And they need to understand about the necessity of feedback involves taking action. So that was the kind of where we started in feedback literacy. Now, three of us took that large data set we got from that big study we did and empirically looked at what are the components of feedback literacy. And this paper on here and the references in the references at the end is about deriving a framework for what do competent students do in terms of feedback. And these are some of the categories we had. And there are a number of items under each of these categories. So a learner exhibiting well-developed feedback literacy commits to feedback as improvement, appreciates that feedback is an active process. They can elicit information from others to improve their learning. They can process information that they receive from others and make sense of it. They can acknowledge that it's an emotional process and work with their own emotions. They also need to see feedback as a reciprocal process they can do with and for each other, and they can enact the outcomes of their processing of feedback information. Now, we've got a whole framework for this, which you can read if you want to, but these are some of the characteristics that we're trying to build in our students. Now, of course, you can't do that in just one first-year course. This is something which students develop over time. And we know that ourselves. We are continually developing our feedback literacy. We write papers and we submit them to journals, and we're continually faced with the prospect of information coming back that we don't know how to react to. We're offended by it, and we're developing our literacy all the time. So feedback literacy isn't something that students get and they tick and they say, oh, I've done that. It's something that we all do throughout our lives. We become more and more feedback literate. We also wrote a paper. Oh, this is one of the Malecki papers that I mentioned earlier. Malecki was doing work in language learning. So we took the idea of feedback processes and feedback literacy, and we discussed how can you embed them in real courses. And this paper talks about embedding these three key ideas. How do we develop students' ability to elicit information? How do we develop their ability to process the information they receive? And how do we develop their capacity for enacting the information? And we give practical examples of how to do that in this paper. And of course, we're talking about students' feedback literacy. We need to be feedback literate ourselves. There's no way we can help students become feedback literate if we're not literate ourselves. So we then moved on, and then we applied the idea of feedback literacy to ourselves. And we identified that there are kind of three levels we need to think about. We need to think about what feedback literacy do we need in terms of the design of whole programs? What do we need in order to design units and subjects? And what do we need at the micro level when we're actually giving comments to students about their work? And again, we have a framework which is in the slides, but I'm not going to linger on because of time. So there are some of the ways in which we can help build students' capacity to engage in feedback. And the important message is that we don't wait until we discover that students don't take any notice of our comments, or they don't even read them. We actually try to do something preemptively right from the start in order to build their capacity. And one of the simplest things you can do, which I mentioned earlier, is get students to identify the comments they would like to receive that will be most helpful to them on their work. So I think that's, where are we? Okay. I might just skip over this discussion period and save the discussion till later, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's fine.
I just want to touch on the final area. So the final area is assessment to build capacity for students' judgments. So this is the dilemma we have. If students can't judge the quality of their own work, how can they learn effectively? How do they know what to do next if they can't tell how good their work is so far? If graduates can't judge the quality of their own work, how can they practice effectively? How can they do any kind of work? They're given a task by their employer and they say, well, I don't know whether I've done this well or not. Well, you wouldn't want an employee that says things like that. You would want an employee that does have the capacity to judge their own work. And of course, if we can't do that for each other, how can we work effectively with each other? So this is a part of the rationale for looking at this issue of developing students' evaluative judgment. Again, there's a book if you want to follow it up. But this is how we defined it. Evaluative judgment is the capacity to make informed decisions about the quality of one's own work and the work of others. So by informed decisions, we mean that we can know what we know and know what we don't know and know what we can do and know what we can't do. And we can give a reason for saying that. And the question you say, well, surely we do that already in our courses. And the answer is yes, we do that. We do encourage students to do this, but often it's not explicit. Often it's not systematic. Often it gets fragmented by the curriculum and all sorts of different courses. And many of our conventional practices inhibit it. They're built on the assumption that only the teacher knows, right? The teacher knows what's correct, and I'm going to tell you, the student, whether it's correct or not. And I'm going to give you a mark. I'm not going to ask you what you think your work deserves. I'm not going to encourage you to reflect on your work. I'm just going to give you the marks. So some of our conventional assessment practices inhibit that. Two key ideas in evaluative judgment. Students need to understand what quality is. And what I mean by that is, if they were confronted with really good quality work, could they tell it was really good? Unless they can understand whether this work is good or not, they're not in the position to produce good work of their own. So we need to focus on how do students understand notions of quality. And then, of course, the other part of it is, can they compare their own work with these notions of quality? And sometimes those notions of quality are embedded in examples, exemplars, illustrations, models, whatever. But they also need to be able to kind of compare their own work with this and discern where the gap is. That's part of the process. And these are some of the components that we can use in evaluative judgment. Getting certain kinds of feedback information, engaging with models, discussing standards with students, discussing criteria with students, using exemplars, etc., etc. And I'm going to rush through this so there's time for a lot of questions. So this is an example of an assignment with added evaluative judgment features. And this is based upon a variation of something I do with my own students. So what I do in class before they go off and do the assignment is we have a discussion in which we ask the question, if you saw a really good example of this assignment, how would you tell? How would you tell that it's really good? So for example, I've taught a class on research methods. So the student's assignment is writing a mini research proposal. So I say to them, how would you judge whether a research proposal is good or not? We have that discussion. I make a note of it, and they get an assignment attachment sheet, which uses these as the criteria. So what I do is that down one side, I list the things that they've identified as features of good quality work. And then when they produce their work, they address those. But before they hand the work in, they get input from a peer. They exchange it with each other, and they revise their assignment as they need to. The student then takes that sheet that I've created with the criteria for good work that they have generated themselves in the class, and they identify the extent to which their work stacks up against these criteria. I mark the work in the normal way, and I give them the marks, but also when I give them feedback information, what I focus on is not whether their work is good or not. I do not focus on whether their work is good or not. I focus on whether they know that their work is good or they know that their work isn't good. And I focus on these discrepancies. Because if the work is good and the student knows it's good, they don't need me to say a lot of words about that. If they know it's weak in certain areas and they've identified the weakness, they don't need me to point it out again. The real need they have from me is where there's a discrepancy between their judgment and my judgment. So that's where I focus in. So I give them student comments on these discrepancies, and then they produce an action plan, which focuses on the areas needing development. So the assignment is exactly the same assignment I used for years before. But what this is an assignment with added evaluative judgment features. So this is an example of how you can build on an existing activity. Now, you have completely different assignments. So, you know, your way of adding evaluative judgment would be different. So these are some of the features. The students engage with criteria and standards ahead of generating work. And they don't do it by reading a rubric, because reading a rubric doesn't help. You know, if they could understand what the rubric meant, they should be teaching the course, not being a student on the course. Students get input from others about their actual work. Students calibrate their judgments against those of others. I need to ask themselves, should I take any notice of what this student said before I hand it in or not? They're led to respond to comments. So there's a feedback process going on. They respond to comments. And the next assignment ideally enables their previous feedback information to be utilized in the next task. So I'm going to open it up for discussion at the end. We've got 9 minutes before the plug is pulled. So you might want to start on questions about this third area, but I'm happy to talk about things more generally. Thank you. Jihad keeps putting his hand up.
I'm sorry, I will lower it down. Thank you. Well, if you can entertain my question again, we teach much more than what we ask in the questions, in exams and assessments.
Yes.
And I wouldn't be able to give feedback for the student work throughout all the materials given in the course. And but an automated way might be able to do it. Like automated program might be asking 200 questions, while a single teacher can only grade maybe 10% of that. So realistically, so
yes.
Maybe in the future there would be a room for such a comprehensive assessment of the student.
Maybe, but let's face the reality now. You do have to give feedback to your students, and you can't give 100 pieces of feedback information. So you've got to make some really, really hard decisions about what is it really most important I focus on. And this is something we confront all the time in feedback. So we've got to make those decisions about what do I say to students that's going to have the most effect, that's going to lead them to improve their work. There are hundreds of things we can say about their work that is true. That's not the issue. You know, the machine can identify all those. What we need to be able to identify as human beings is which of all those many, many things I could say to that student are going to be the things that make the difference. And this is how we need to shift our thinking about providing feedback information. So we don't get a student's work and write all the things about it that we could possibly say. We think very carefully about, of all the things I might say, what are the things that are most going to influence the student? So that's the thinking that we need to start to adopt here. Yeah. And we can do that most effectively if we already know from the student what the things are that are most bothering them.
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions, Mojib, from the chat that you think might be good to focus on? I'm reading something here. Should we teach students about how to provide feedback? Yes. Yes, there's various guidelines around about giving and receiving feedback information. I've got some myself. Other people have produced them. Yes, absolutely, we should teach them. It's like this is a very sophisticated pedagogic process, which we all need to develop the capacity to do, and we need it in our normal lives. So yes, we should introduce students to it. There's another question about handling negative feedback and turning it to provide an opportunity for improvement. I'm not quite sure what you mean by negative feedback. If we look at the research on feedback information, we can identify, or Hattie and Timpley have identified, that there are certain types of feedback that have greater or lesser effect, and some feedback has a negative effect. So we need to be very, very careful about comments that we make which leave the students with less knowledge and less learning than when they started. Now you might say, well, that's crazy. I mean, how could I provide students with information and unlearn them? Well, I'm afraid the research evidence suggests that that is entirely possible and is a frequent occurrence. So, for example, we need to avoid certain things. We need avoiding referring to students and individual personal characteristics of the students. We need to focus on the student's work, not the student. We must never attribute blame to students. We mustn't judge the student as a student. We mustn't say things like, well, you didn't bother, even, tackling that question with any, energy. We must always treat students on their merits and not on their attributes. So they're the kind of things that are typically talked about in the literature on negative feedback. Another thing about negative feedback, which is commonly talked about, particularly in health areas for some reason, and that's the dreaded feedback sandwich. I don't know whether you've come across the feedback sandwich. You don't want to learn it because it's not good. So a feedback sandwich is you say something nice to the student, you then give them the bad information, the difficult, problematic information, and then you say something nice. And the idea is that the student should consume this feedback information like a sandwich, and they take their medicine because it's wrapped up against two things you say which are nice. I'm afraid there is not a shred of empirical evidence that this is worthwhile. In fact, what happens is that the students remember the good things that are said, and they completely forget the bit in the middle, which was your main message. So I don't like the idea of negative feedback in the sense that this is nasty information. All the information we provide to students might be challenging, but it's all about them producing better work in the future. And that's what we need to focus on. So time is running out, so I'm going to go to my last slide. Oh, that's not the last slide. That's just a resource that we provided about developing evaluative judgment. We handed out this at Deakin University, and it helps staff design things into their courses. My final slide, just to sum up, we must deliberately design assessment and feedback to have a continuing positive effect on student learning. And we must do it in such a way that we equip students for themselves, not just with knowledge and skills, but equipping them to be more effective learners. First one. Second one, in an outcomes-based world, students must be comfortable in understanding and using standards and criteria for themselves and with each other. Peer interaction, peer feedback, formal and informal, is very important. Building the capacity to judge one's own work and that of others is an educational outcome on which all the others are dependent. If we're successful in doing that, then students are given assistance with everything else that we do. And finally, we equip students for the future not primarily through the specific knowledge and skills they acquire, but through their capacity to make informed judgments through their own practice now and in the future. So thank you very much for your engagement. I found it a very stimulating time, and there's been some very, very interesting questions. Thank you.
And Dr. Mujib, you are muted. And Dr. Mujib, you are muted.
Thank you very much, Professor David, for this interesting workshop. Thank you all for joining us today. And I say to all, goodbye and thank you.
So I assume that everyone knows how to access the slides. So
yes, the slides, we will share them with all the participants, yeah, after the event.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Mujib, for sharing it so well.
Yeah, and if they have some other questions, they can, or some of the questions that we did not answer throughout we have somehow to pick some of the questions. They will be answered afterward, inshallah.
Yeah, if some of them are still thought to be very important, then I'm happy to follow up.
Yeah. Thank you very
This
much.
is a very fast-moving area, so keep up with all the research that's going on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheerio.
Bye. Assalamu alaikum.